Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely overturn a massive, frankly almost universal, misconception about our modern legal system. We tend to view ancient biblical property damage laws as, well, obsolete. We look at them as this quaint, outdated collection of agricultural codes that were maybe relevant to ancient farmers wandering the desert, but have absolutely zero bearing on our highly technological modern world. But actually, that couldn't be further from the truth. As we're going to uncover today, these ancient texts aren't just historically interesting. They are actually the exact, highly sophisticated structural blueprints for modern civil liability. The legal framework governing literally everything from autonomous artificial intelligence to massive environmental disasters, it was perfectly codified thousands of years ago.
So, here is our roadmap for today's analysis. We're going to systematically progress through a brief introduction, then dive into the four major archetypes of liability: active agents, passive hazards, resource encroachment, and propagating forces. Finally, we'll synthesize all of this into what we call the metric of neighbor love. Let's dive right in. Section 1. Ancient Blueprints, Modern Law. Let's set the stage. To truly understand this framework, we first have to grasp the incredible taxonomy found in the texts of Exodus chapters 21 and 22. These laws categorize hazards based on a highly logical, almost mathematical matrix. The law essentially asks two primary questions to determine fault. First, is the hazard animate, meaning is it a living, moving thing with its own agency, or is it inanimate and static? Second, is the hazard active in seeking out destruction, or is it entirely passive, requiring the victim or some random external force to actually trigger the damage? Modern common law, and frankly the civil codes of almost every developed nation, actively replicate this exact taxonomy to distribute financial responsibility today. According to the Gemini analysis, and this is absolutely key here, the structural logic of ancient Near Eastern statutory law does not expire with changing technology. It merely shifts from agricultural variables to industrial equivalents. This right here is our foundational thesis for today. The core requirement of justice remains entirely unchanged across the millennia. The absolute mandate is this: whoever introduces a risk into the community bears the full economic burden of its failure.
Moving into Section 2, the horn, active animate agents.
In ancient legal taxonomy, this first category is known as shore, or the ox. This governs damage caused by an animate, moving agent that rightfully belongs to an owner. The specific biblical framework for this is laid out in remarkable detail in Exodus chapter 21, specifically verses 28 through 32 and verses 35 through 36. The ancient logic here establishes an owner's strict responsibility for an independent agent that possesses its own momentum. This is an absolutely crucial concept. The owner isn't out there physically causing the damage themselves. They aren't the ones ramming into a neighbor's cart. But because they deployed an asset, an entity that can act independently, the law requires them to absorb the cost of its actions. Think about the profound nature of that for a second. The law is saying, you deploy the asset, therefore you own the consequences of its momentum. Your property acts as an extension of your own agency in the public square.
But the biblical text doesn't stop there. It introduces a genuinely brilliant nuance. It legally distinguishes between two very different states of this active agent. First, we have what is called the tum, which translates to the innocent ox. Now, this represents an unprecedented baseline accident. The agent has never caused harm before. There's no history of violence. In this case, restitution is absolutely still required, but it's treated legally as a standard unforeseen accident. The owner pays, but they aren't viewed as grossly negligent. Contrast this entirely with the second state, the muad, or the forewarned ox. This occurs when an owner has been explicitly warned of their property's dangerous propensity. They know it's a threat, but they actively fail to restrain it. According to the text, this ancient distinction is the direct, undeniable historical root of the modern one-bite rule in animal liability, which eventually evolved into our modern doctrine of strict liability. Ignoring a documented pattern of danger fundamentally shifts the legal culpability. It demands a much, much harsher penalty because the owner's negligence is now active and intentional.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, but I don't own an ox. Right, but we are no longer just talking about livestock. Industrial autonomous systems, self-driving fleets, and robotics follow this exact same legal architecture today. Imagine you're managing a massive industrial fulfillment center, and you're utilizing a cutting-edge, highly automated, AI-driven forklift fleet. If a brand new forklift undergoes a completely unpredictable software glitch on day one and crashes into a loading dock causing damage, that is the exact Tom scenario. It's a baseline accident, your company pays for the damage, but the legal culpability remains standard negligence. But what if instead, you as the fleet manager receive 3 separate error logs over a month, clearly indicating that a specific forklift has a faulty proximity sensor that occasionally fails to detect human workers? If you look at those logs and you leave that unit active on the warehouse floor simply because you need to hit your daily shipping quotas, and then a worker gets critically injured, that is textbook Shore Muad. You blatantly ignored a documented pattern of danger. Under modern law, just as in the ancient biblical law, this elevates the case from standard negligence straight to gross negligence. Prioritizing operational quotas over human safety triggers massive, ruinous, punitive damages. The technological variables changed, the structural logic didn't budge an inch.
This brings us to Section 3, the pit, passive structural hazards. So, our second major tort archetype is bore, or the pit. This addresses damage caused by a stationary, passive hazard created by a person in a shared or public space. Now, the structural mechanism of this hazard is entirely different from the ox and incredibly specific. The pit does not move to cause damage. A hole in the ground has no momentum. Rather, the victim moves into the danger due to the creator's explicit failure to mitigate the risk. This introduces a massive legal concept into human history, nonfeasance. This is the failure to act. It's the failure to secure a space that you've personally altered. Looking directly at the source text, specifically Exodus chapter 21, verses 33 through 34, the ancient code states, should a person open a pit, or should a person dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls in, the one responsible for the pit must pay. This outlines a profound economic penalty for nonfeasance. Think about the psychology here. If you dig a hole, maybe to access a well or lay a foundation, and you fail to cover it before you walk away, you have actively prioritized your own immediate convenience over the physical safety of your surrounding community. You didn't push the donkey into the hole, sure, but you created the unnatural hazard in a shared space. Therefore, you are absolutely legally responsible for the inevitable encounter someone else will have with it.
Our analysis directly maps this ancient logic to modern premises liability and the widely known attractive nuisance doctrine. Consider a modern scenario. A commercial real estate developer is renovating a busy sidewalk outside a massive urban office building. The construction workers excavate a deep trench to lay new fiber optic cables. But it's 5 p.m. on a Friday, they're tired, and they leave for the weekend without installing proper barricades, high-visibility tape, or warning lights. If a pedestrian walking home at dusk trips and falls into that trench, suffering severe injuries, this is an identical one-to-one application of Exodus 21. The developer created a passive hazard in a public right-of-way and failed to secure it. Municipal negligence laws and massive corporate liability suites regarding unmarked construction sites, or frankly even something as mundane as a missing wet floor sign in a grocery store aisle, rest entirely on the structural logic of the bore. In the eyes of the law, the failure to warn is legally indistinguishable from actively causing the harm yourself.
Let's move to Section 4, the tooth, resource encroachment. This third category is known as mehev, which translates literally to the crop destroyer, or more commonly, the tooth. It governs damage caused by an animal grazing or consuming resources in another person's private field or vineyard. We find the governance for this in Exodus chapter 22, verse 5. The mechanics here are fascinating, and they're quite different from what we've seen so far. You see, the damage isn't rooted in random violence, like the goring ox, and it's not a passive trap like the pit. The damage here is a direct result of unjust consumption. It is the unauthorized crossing of boundaries, where one person's asset naturally fulfills its own biological drives, but it does so by consuming the economic capital of another person, resulting in severe material loss. Today, we apply this exact same evidentiary standard to industrial encroachment. This is highly relevant. Imagine a massive commercial pesticide spraying company, or maybe a huge industrial farm, operating right next door to a small, certified organic vineyard. The industrial operation regularly sprays harsh chemical agents during high winds, or perhaps they allow their chemical runoff to seep down through the shared water table and straight into the neighbor's soil. Over time, those chemicals contaminate the vineyard. It completely ruins the harvest and strips the small farm of its highly valuable organic certification. Now, the industrial company didn't maliciously set out to destroy the crop. They weren't trying to be violent. However, their operational corporate consumption of the shared environment unlawfully depleted their neighbor's resource space. Modern civil trespass to land and the complex doctrines of private nuisance do not require violent intent to secure a conviction. They only require unauthorized extraction or contamination. If your operation quietly eats your neighbor's livelihood, you are fully liable under the law of the tooth.
Which brings us to Section 5, the fire, volatile, propagating forces.
This final hazard archetype is ESH, or the fire. This incredibly important law covers damage caused by an active, spreading hazard that a person kindles, but that specifically moves and propagates via an external agent, like the wind. This requires an exhaustive explanation because the standard of liability established here is frankly immense. Under this law, the individual who kindles the initial hazard is held legally liable for the entire, unpredictable downstream trajectory of the destruction. You cannot stand in front of a judge and claim that because the wind carried the spark, you are suddenly no longer responsible. The logic is unyielding. You introduced a volatile, highly dangerous element into an environment where natural forces could predictably escalate it. Therefore, you own the entire chain reaction.
The source text in Exodus chapter 22, verse 6 is totally definitive on this point. It reads, "If a fire breaks out and spreads into brushwood so that stacked grain or standing grain or the field is consumed, the one who started the fire must make full restitution." Listen to the weight of that. The one who started the fire. This explicit legal code lays the absolute foundation for one of the most critical concepts in modern jurisprudence. An intervening force of nature does not sever the chain of proximate causation. This aligns perfectly, with our modern doctrine of strict liability for ultra-hazardous activities. Think about a modern electric utility company, a massive corporation. They failed to clear the dry, dead overgrowth around their high-voltage transmission lines during a severe regional drought. A strong windstorm rolls through. It snaps a dead branch, and that branch hits the unmaintained power line. It sparks, igniting a massive, fast-moving wildfire that ends up consuming an entire residential subdivision 30 miles downwind. In court, that utility company will inevitably hire expensive lawyers to argue, hey, we didn't carry the fire to those homes, the wind did. It was an act of God. The law of Ish flatly, unequivocally rejects this flawed defense. Because the corporation introduced and failed to maintain the initial volatile risk, they bear full, unmitigated responsibility for the entire path of destruction. The wind is a predictable multiplier, not an excuse for corporate negligence.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the metric of neighbor love.
Having established the intense, granular mechanics of these four distinct archetypes, we must now pivot from these dry legal codes to what is actually a profound theological synthesis. The critical question we have to ask ourselves is this: how do these strict liability frameworks, the ox, the pit, the tooth, and the fire, how do they actually relate to the second greatest commandment? I really want to invite you to look beyond mere economic restitution here. We need to look deeply into the spiritual intent that undergirds this entire legal structure. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, we find the famous command. It simply says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, applying a strict historical grammatical method to this text, we discover something amazing. According to the Gemini analysis, this commandment is not meant to be some abstract emotional state. It's not just a subjective, warm, fuzzy feeling you have about the people living next to you. Rather, it functions legally as an inductive summary clause. It is the overarching summary for highly concrete, actionable boundaries designed specifically to protect a neighbor's physical life, their reputation, and their economic stability. Let's break down this legal theological synthesis, because it is staggering. Tort law, as it turns out, is the external, objective metric that measures whether love is actually being executed or violated in reality. First, look at the pit. This represents the explicit prevention of harm. Loving your neighbor means viewing their physical body with the exact same defensive hypervigilance you apply to your own. If you wouldn't want your own leg broken by a hidden trap in the dark, you absolutely cannot leave an unmarked trench in a shared space. Nonfeasance in this framework is a literal failure to love. Second, the fire. This represents your scope of responsibility. Neighbor love demands radical foresight. It insists that you must calculate the downstream consequences of your actions on others before you ever act. Carelessly deploying a volatile element, whether that's a literal fire or perhaps a volatile digital algorithm that spreads and causes chaos, is a profound moral failure. Third, the ox. This is the management of risk. Indifference to a known risk is an explicit, documented violation of love. To know that your property, be it a farm animal or an autonomous AI fleet, poses a threat to a neighbor's livelihood and to leave it unsecured just to save a few bucks, that is to treat their well-being as fundamentally secondary to your own convenience. And finally, the tooth represents the preservation of borders. Loving a neighbor requires an active, intentional restraint of your own corporate or personal consumption. You have to ensure that your growth does not quietly diminish or erode the survival capital of those living alongside you. Summarizing this deep dive, the undeniable continuity of justice across thousands of years is crystal clear. God's law establishes a very stark reality. You cannot claim to love your neighbor if you are negligent with your property, reckless with your actions, or indifferent to the structural hazards you introduce into your community. Full restitution isn't just a municipal fine. It is the mandatory act of repentance required to repair the fabric of the community you damaged. I really want to conclude with this provocative thought, especially as you examine your own operational footprint in whatever career, major, or life stage you are currently in. Ask yourself, are you treating your neighbor's well-being as a secondary concern to your own convenience? Because the truth is, whether you are writing code for an autonomous delivery system, managing a massive commercial construction site, or frankly, just maintaining your own personal property, the ancient blueprints demand total accountability. To introduce risk without taking responsibility is not just a civil infraction, it is a failure to love. Thank you for joining me in this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.